Frontier Foundation filed a lawsuit Thursday against the National Security Agency, President Bush, and Vice President Dick Cheney, challenging the legality of the administration's electronic surveillance program. The class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of all residential AT&T customers and alleges that the NSA is conducting mass surveillance on U.S. residents in violation of their First and Fourth Amendment rights. A new book by award-winning journalist Barton Gellman reveals that the vice president played a crucial role in maintaining this program of warrantless spying, even after Justice Department officials began to doubt its legality in 2004. The book is called Angler, the Cheney Vice Presidency.
With less than 2 months to go before the election, the media's attention has been on the recently confirmed vice presidential nominees, Sarah Palin and Joe Biden. But after nearly 8 years in office, how much do we know about our current vice president? According to Gellman, there's quite a bit we've all been kept in the dark about, right from the decision to select Cheney as Bush's running mate to winning congressional approval for war in Iraq and the administration's illegal wiretapping program. Gellman writes, quote, "The history of the Bush administration cannot be written without close attention to the moments when Cheney took the helm, sometimes at Bush's direction, sometimes with his tacit consent, and sometimes without the president's apparent awareness. Cheney's indifference to public opinion," Gellman writes, "verged on contempt." Barton Gellman, the author of Angler, the Cheney Vice Presidency, joins us here in our Firehouse studio. He's special projects reporter of the Washington Post. His series on Cheney for the Post, written with partner Joe Becker, won a 2008 Pulitzer Prize, a George Polk Award, and the Goldsmith Prize for investigative reporting. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thanks for having me.
Well, you know, the McCain campaign threatened to sue the National Enquirer over a story they had on Sarah Palin. And the response of the National Enquirer was, you know, we've investigated, I don't know if they said, we've investigated her for a few weeks. This was just after her candidacy was announced, which is more than we can say for you, they said to the McCain campaign in vetting her for vice president. Well, let's go back to the current vice president and how he was chosen. Wasn't he in charge of the vice presidential pick for George Bush?
Yeah, well, everyone knows that Bush asked Dick Cheney to manage and oversee the vice presidential selection process, and there have been jokes for years about how he selected himself. And honestly, that's not true. Bush did choose him, but the process made for an interesting contrast to Sarah Palin's. Dick Cheney oversaw the most probing, most intrusive vetting of potential vice presidents that I think there's ever been. He had, for sure, the longest questionnaire, questions that went to as bald as, is there something that could be used to blackmail you, and if so, what? But he was looking for direct access. He insisted that the candidates sign waivers allowing him complete access to their medical and psychiatric records, FBI files, financial files, IRS returns, and so on. Now, to a substantial degree, that's appropriate. You don't want to have a blackmailable vice president and potential commander-in-chief. The tricky thing is that when they pulled the switch and when Dick Cheney became the president's choice, or the candidate's choice, he did not go through the same vetting process. He did not fill out his own questionnaire, which is contrary to what the campaign said at the time. He did not turn over even most of his public documents, old speeches and testimony and so forth. Halliburton would not cooperate with financial inquiries, and the cardiac surgeon, an eminent, famous surgeon who was brought out by the campaign to vouch for Cheney's heart health, says in an on-the-record interview in the book that he never actually met Cheney or reviewed his medical records.
And it is amazing, as you point out, that even for top security clearance, most people are only required to go back about 7 years in their history. He wanted an entire life. Every speech that any potential vice presidential candidate had made, anything they had said, and yet he doesn't do it for himself. So it's almost as if Palin is not the first person who hasn't been thoroughly vetted before being chosen as vice presidential candidate.
Well, look, I mean, in fairness, Dick Cheney had a long record that was pretty well known, and he'd been confirmed by the Senate to be Secretary of Defense. He'd been scrutinized pretty closely over the years, but even just as a political matter, for the benefit of the campaign, his intense desire for secrecy and privacy was harmful because the Democrats had done a lot more opposition research on Cheney than the campaign had done on him in its own headquarters. And so when they started bringing out his old votes as political lines of attack, against the Martin Luther King holiday or school lunch programs, whatever it was, the campaign didn't actually know what his votes were.
Can you talk about Vice President Cheney leaking confidential information to discredit a rival?
This is an accusation made by one of the short-listed candidates for Bush's running mate, the governor of Oklahoma right next door, Frank Keating, who was a friend of Bush and someone who was described at the campaign as a finalist. He filled out all the paperwork, and he included in it, when asked, is there anything in your record that could potentially embarrass you or the campaign? He said, look, I don't think this is embarrassing, but I'll let you know that a friend of mine has paid the college tuition of my kids. Sort of a big gift from someone who did have certain interests in, not to make money for himself, but in a cause before the federal government. And it could be made to look bad. It was sort of on the line enough that Keating asked for an opinion from the government ethics office, and the ethics office cleared it. And a somewhat distorted version of this disclosure got leaked to Newsweek after Cheney was chosen as running mate and while Bush was starting to form a cabinet. Keating was also said to be a leading candidate to be Attorney General. And in fact, a bunch of very conservative and influential organizations like the Federalist Society were pushing his candidacy. And that was not Cheney's choice. And lo and behold, one day, Newsweek comes up with this piece of his vetting file, except that Newsweek says that he didn't disclose it. Frank Keating tells me for the first time on the record, and I sort of lay out the story at length in Angler, that he sees no way this could have been produced by anybody but Cheney or his 3 close aides who were the only ones who saw the files. He said, Dick Cheney coming into my life has been like a black cloud. Now, people with an axe to grind you have to worry about. He didn't get a job. He was disappointed. One thing that gave it more credence for me is that another Republican governor, close friend of Bush, who was also said to be a finalist, John Engler of Michigan, told me that he agrees with Frank Keating. He doesn't see any way it could have leaked without Cheney's participation.
And the title of your book, Engler?
Cheney's Secret Service code name. They have a wry sense of humor about the way they give code names, and a lot of times they have a double meaning. Obviously, Cheney is an avid fisherman. I thought it was a nice metaphor for the way that he works. He tends to approach the levers of power obliquely. He doesn't like you to see him coming. Doesn't like to have an overt public role. He finds his way to the place where decisions are made and often doesn't leave many signs of his presence.
We're going to continue this conversation in a moment. Our guest is the 2008 Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Barton Gellman. His book is just out. It's called Angler, the Cheney Vice Presidency. Stay with us.